Hey everyone, I'm Mark, and with Flight Sim 2024 coming out in the next few weeks, I thought it might be a good time to have a look at the basics of hand flying, both as a refresher for me and you, and also as an intro for everyone else who's likely going to be jumping on board soon. We're using the Cessna 172 for this since it's as simple as it gets, and although we're doing it at the Old Makes field today from FS95 days, you could use any airport that you want so long as there's enough open space around. And before we get going, we'll just have a quick look at the basic flight controls that we'll need today, starting with the pitch, roll, and yaw axes. Whether you're using an Xbox controller, a flight stick, or even a yoke like I am today, you can control the pitch of the plane by pushing it forwards or backwards, which will move the elevators at the back of the plane, and rolling left or right with the ailerons on either wing. The rudder, on the other hand, is meant to swing our nose left or right in the yaw or Z axis, and on the ground we'll need it to keep ourselves on the runway center line, and in the air we'll need it anytime that the wind is blowing across the plane, but especially on takeoff and landing. Having actual pedals makes controlling the yaw a whole lot more intuitive, but if you're using a flight stick instead, the twist action can substitute for them, and although there is an option to let the computer control the rudder for you, I'd really only recommend that as a last resort. We're going to look at how to use the flaps when we come back around and land to keep things a little bit simpler here since we don't absolutely need them for takeoff. And the other tiny control surface that I want to quickly mention before we get going here is the elevator trim. This controls a little tab that's at the back of the elevators, and whenever you're holding any type of forward or backwards pressure on the controls, it's going to allow you to relieve that pressure so that you can leave the controls in a neutral position and keep the plane in the pitch that it's currently in. A lot of planes are going to have some kind of mark or range where you should be putting the trim for takeoff, and it's always best to check on this before you get going so that you don't have any difficulty when it comes time to get off the ground. You'll want to make sure that you have some easy to reach keys for the trim up and trim down actions though, because you'll be adjusting it every single time there's a configuration change. So whether you're changing the power, the pitch, extending or retracting flaps, each of these is going to require you to retrim. Last but definitely not least, to be able to get moving, we have to use the throttle, which is what produces the thrust to propel us forward. And in a small plane like this, it actually impacts our airspeed as well as our altitude, as we're going to see as we get going here. Alright, so I'll progressively start to apply power, and the first thing that you're going to notice is that the plane wants to start to veer off to the left, and that's mostly due to the torque and the force of the propeller. So to stay on the center line, what we need to do is get back to the right. So I'm pushing on the right rudder pedal to push us back in that direction. As the airspeed continues to build up, we're watching for it to reach the R that's on the airspeed tape, and that's going to be our cue to start pulling back on the controls to get airborne. Once we're established in the climb, we can slowly work out the rudder input that we were just using, and we'll switch our focus now more towards our attitude and our airspeed. Right now we're in a fairly nose-up pitch attitude, and for the first part of the climb on most departures, you'll want to pitch the plane so that the airspeed lines up with the little Y that's on the airspeed tape, and like that you'll get the best rate of climb for the plane that you're flying. I'm pulling the controls towards me to keep the nose up in this attitude, and to get the airspeed where I want it, which is about 75 knots, all I'm doing is lowering or raising the nose very subtly to decrease or increase the airspeed. Once we've reached pattern altitude, so about 1,000 feet above the airfield, we can drop the nose a little bit to climb out at a more comfortable climb rate between 500 and 700 feet per minute instead. And the other thing that we can do is reduce the throttle just a little bit to set it for our cruise climb. If you have a look at our RPM gauge, it's right near its limit right now, so we'll bring it back just slightly so that it's at the top of the green range on the arc, which will have the effect of producing slightly less thrust, but since we dropped our nose a bit already, it won't really impact us in any way. I'm still holding a fair bit of back pressure to keep it in this attitude though, and this is where the trim comes in handy because it'll allow me to relieve that pressure that I'm holding on the controls and keep the wings at the angle that we want them at. If I were to let go of the controls now, the nose would drop on us, meaning that we need to add in some nose up trim. So I'll turn the trim wheel towards us to do that. And I've actually added in way too much trim here. You can see the plane wanted to pitch up into the air and I had to hold it back by applying some forward pressure on the controls now. The lesson here is that you should always make very small changes to the trim at first, and now since I have forward pressure on the controls, I have to apply some nose down trim to get it back where I want, and each time I'm letting it settle down for a little bit before I make another adjustment. Once you get it set just right though, you'll be able to remove all of your inputs on the controls and the plane should continue to climb at the pitch attitude that you had it at, just like you see now. As we come up on 3,000 feet is where we'll level off, and it's going to be a 3-step process to get us to wings level, which as you get more experience, you'll be able to do most of them simultaneously. The first step, once you're getting close to your target altitude, is to slowly push the controls forward so that you stay level where you want to be, and then let the airspeed build up for a bit so that you can get to your cruise speed a little bit quicker. As the plane continues to accelerate, you'll have to apply more and more forward pressure on the controls. So to alleviate some of that, I'll start by setting my cruise power first, which in the 172, I like to use 2400 RPM so that I can have just that little extra kick of speed. The last step is to set our trim, and if I were to let go of the controls just a bit here, you can see it still wants to pitch up on me, so I'll need to add in some more nose down trim, so turning the wheel forward this time. And just like we saw when we did this a few minutes ago, it's all about making small changes and giving the plane some time to adjust after each change to get it in the right spot. Hitting a little pocket of turbulence like we just did here definitely doesn't help. However, until the plane settles down at its final cruise speed, you won't be able to set the trim perfectly yet anyways, but it's still useful to add some in as soon as you're holding any type of pressure on the controls. Fine-tuning it to stay level at cruise is probably the most difficult part of adjusting the trim, but with time you get used to it. We're going to start making our way back towards the airport now, and we've basically been flying the runway heading since we took off, so what we're going to do today is effectively a very large and very high traffic pattern. It's going to take us in a loop back to our departure point. Normally a traffic pattern is done at 1,000 feet above the airfield and you'd stay within 2 miles of the runway at all times, but we're extending that here so that we can explore a little bit more about how to hand fly the plane. However, at this point we're ready for our first turn, which is going to be a 90-degree turn to the right, so we'll start turning towards 090 on the heading indicator. At the top of the attitude indicator, you can see there are little notches that tell you how steep of a bank angle you're turning, with the first 3 notches on either side being 10 degrees each, and then the notch after that is 45 degrees, and then the last one is at 60 degrees. For the most part, when you're taking a turn, you'll want it to be somewhere between 10 and 30 degrees, but there are some occasions when a steeper turn is necessary, and you can use these as a gauge whenever you need them. The easiest way to keep track of where you are relative to the airport is to check out the multifunction display, and you can play with the range dial to see as far or as close as you want, and you can cross-reference what you're seeing there by actually looking around at where you want to go. Right now we're flying perpendicular to the runway that we want to land on, which is just in the distance over there, and since we want to stay relatively close to the runway, we're going to start our next 90-degree turn to get ourselves parallel to where we want to land now. When you drop the wing to make a turn like this, the plane has a tendency to start to descend slightly, and I'm compensating for that here by pulling back on the controls just a bit. This is happening because when you roll in a given direction, the ailerons on either wing get deflected, so there's a little less vertical lift being generated and it results in a slight descent. However, you wouldn't trim for this change, and once you roll out to wings level, it should stabilize to where it was before the turn. Our next focus is going to be on getting to pattern altitude by the time that we're back at the airport, and the rough math that I use to figure out when to descend is to take the first digit of the altitude that I'm currently at and then multiply that by 3 to get a top of descent of 9 miles for today. The multifunction display is set to show a range of 4 miles at the moment, and the airport is just a bit beyond that off the bottom of the screen, so I'm going to start my descent right away, and it's going to be the same 3 steps that we did earlier, so pitch, power, and trim. I started by reducing power here since that'll get us going in the descent right away, with the only question left to figure out then is how quickly to make that descent. And the rule of thumb that I use for that is to take my ground speed, divide it by 2, and then add a 0 to it, giving us about 550 feet per minute. So I'm making very small power adjustments here to set our vertical speed properly. You might have noticed though that I didn't actually touch the trim at all here. All I did was reduce power to change our pitch. And what's interesting about that is that if you look at our airspeed, it's staying fairly constant. In fact, if I were to reduce power even more, we'd continue to fly at this speed and only our pitch and consequently our descent rate would change. So really what that's telling us is the trimming not only relieves the pressure that we have on the controls, it also sets our airspeed as well. As we're descending, I want to quickly introduce you to another concept, and that's the basics of dealing with wind. Here's the deal, when there's wind, you can't just point your nose at the heading that you want to fly because the wind's gonna push you around. So what you do is you crab into it so that you can continue to fly the track that you want across the ground. When you enable it in the PFD options, the wind direction and speed is shown right here in the G1000, and it's a light quartering tailwind at 5 knots that we've got right now. That means the wind is going to push us from right to left, but it's fairly light, so I only need a slight correction to the right to stay on track, and I'm trying to keep on a heading of about 181 instead. And in a G1000, you can also always check what your track across the ground is easily because it's shown right at the top of the multifunction display. The stronger the wind is, the bigger the correction you'll need, and when the wind changes, say for example when we turn ourselves towards the runway in a few minutes, you'll need to adjust again so that you stay on track. I've barely had to touch the controls for the last few minutes during the descent, but we're coming up on our pattern altitude now, so to level off it's going to be the same 3 steps that we've seen before. I'll start by adding back in a little bit of power to slow our descent rate down, and then once we reach our target in a couple of feet here, I'll pull back on the controls to stay wings level, and finally the last step, I'll use the trim to relieve that pressure that I'm exerting on the controls, just like we saw before, making small corrections and giving it time to adjust. We're flying on a heading that's keeping us parallel to the airfield that's just off to our right now, so to get turned back around towards the runway, we'll need to make 2 more turns. The base turn, which will put us perpendicular to the runway, and then the final turn that'll line us up with it. And this is one place where I struggled for a long time because things tend to happen fast here. For a normal pattern, you'd want to be 1 to 2 miles offset from the runway, and a good rule of thumb for that in a high wing plane like this is to look for the airfield to be about halfway up when you look out of the side window. And if we have a look at that now, we are a touch further out here, but that'll still be fine. As you get more experience, you can make your traffic pattern a lot tighter with shorter base and final legs, but when you're just getting started, and honestly even now sometimes for me when the surrounding terrain isn't an issue, an easy way to do it is to just count 1 minute once you're past the abeam point of the runway threshold, which we're crossing just about now. You can use the clock at the bottom right of the PFD to know when it's been a minute, and if you really want, there's also an integrated stopwatch that you can bring up there. However, our next point of focus here is going to be the flaps. The C-172 that we're flying today has 4 positions for the flaps, and we'll extend the first notch now. And you can see that the plane starts to go nose up here, and that's because the first 15 degrees or so of flaps generate more lift and drag, which is why you would normally want to use them on takeoff. To avoid that effect as you extend the flaps, you can apply some forward pressure on the controls as well as retrim if you need to. Anything beyond 15 degrees of flaps will also generate some lift, but it'll mostly generate more drag, so I'll usually go to flaps 2 once I turn onto base, and then flaps 3 once I'm on final. That's 1 minute already on the clock, so we're starting our base turn, and we've already been slowly trickling down just a little bit since we went past the abeam point, but since we're flying a longer final approach, we can take our time on the descent here, and it'll actually make things a whole lot easier for us. Again, we're doing a 90-degree turn, and since the runway runs direct north-south, we're looking to roll out on a heading of 270. However, we should probably crab into the wind slightly again and fly something closer to 272 or 273 to stay perpendicular to the runway. Turning final can be tricky though, and timing it right is something that takes a lot of practice to roll out exactly on the center line. But one trick to get you started is to break the turn up into 245-degree turns, which will make it a lot easier to line yourself up properly. Like that, you can keep the runway in view and continue to make small adjustments to the pitch, power, and trim, and it'll give you a really good idea of if you're too high or too low on the approach. Most runways are going to have a 3-degree descent path on final, and to help you out with it, oftentimes there will be a series of white and red lights off to the side of the runway that can help you figure out if you're too high or too low. If you look closely to the left side of the runway, you'll notice there are 2 red lights that are arranged vertically here, and basically anytime that you see more red lights, it means that you're too low, and if you see more white lights, it means that you're too high. When you see the same number of white and red lights like we do now, that's when you can start to descend at your 3-degree descent rate, which is going to be about 450 feet per minute in this plane. If you're landing somewhere and there are no landing lights, you'll have to rely on what the runway looks like to figure out where you are on the glide path, and it should look about like what you're seeing now. Instead, if the runway looks long and skinny, that means that you're too high, and your best bet is to reduce power, which will help increase your descent rate without picking up too much extra speed. Just don't forget to bring the power back on once you catch up to the descent path, because you can easily end up close to stall speed with the power in your idle. If you're too low, on the other hand, you'll want to increase power slightly to slow your descent rate down, and then once you're back on the ideal path again, you can bring the power back to where it was to continue your descent. At the end of the day, landing is the phase of flight where you have to bring everything together to make the right corrections to your pitch and power, and if you screwed up the approach, there's nothing wrong with going around until you get it right. As you come up on the runway threshold, you'll want to be at your final landing speed, which in this plane is around 55 to 60 knots, and right around 10 to 20 feet is where you can do a very gentle flare, so pulling back on the controls so that the main gear touch down first, and then you can let the nose come down as well. I'll leave you today with a few different series that I've done on navigation inside of Microsoft Flight Sim, and if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to like and subscribe on your way out.